Britain was terribly important to Soviet Russia and to Bolsheviks, and equally the Bolsheviks were very important in a different way for Britain in the 1920s. Marx obviously had hoped that there would be a British Revolution. He thought there'd be a revolution in Germany or Britain before there was one in Russia. Lots of Bolsheviks had spent time in this city, and so they had seen it firsthand. And it was a particular place for them to focus on. Britain was, of course, in those days one of the most important, if not the most important country in the world. But it was a place that the Bolsheviks wanted to provoke. Now, by late 1919, the game was up in terms of the Allied expeditionary force to Russia. It had become clear that with the resources available to it and the resources that the Allies were able to pour into it, there wasn't going to be any way to beat the Soviets. And they were going to win, and they were going to be in power for some foreseeable period of time. And this was the fundamental split that would run right through the 1920s. There was idealism on the left, obviously, people who were very excited about Soviet Russia. There was also idealism on the right, people who thought you can't talk to these people, much in the same way that people say today you can't talk to terrorists. You just must have nothing to do with them. And in the middle then there was a seam, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide, of pragmatism. When Lord Curzon, who was the Foreign Secretary by this point, refused to shake hands with them, Lloyd George ordered him to do so and told him to behave like a gentleman. And the Bolsheviks, for their part, Krasin and Kamenev, mostly in the meetings showed themselves to be perfectly comfortable on the world stage, able to talk about, maybe we can do this, but in return for that we need this from you, just a normal kind of negotiation. British intelligence was reporting into the government weekly, and often more frequently to people like Churchill, who were trusted friends of it, saying we must get rid of these people, and above all else we must not do a deal with them, because we can't have them and larger numbers of Bolsheviks in London indefinitely. Nonetheless, Lloyd George forced it through, and so in March 1921, a treaty was signed, and a new organisation was started called ARCOS, the All-Russian Cooperative Society. Lots of the negotiating team that had negotiated the treaty stayed, and they were joined quite quickly by dozens of other Soviet citizens, and eventually, by 1924, by hundreds of Soviet citizens. What does it mean? What did it mean for British intelligence to be following people in the 1920s? They identified suspects by looking at who an existing suspect knew, following all of them for a few weeks, seeing who had anything interesting going on, keeping those people on the books, putting everyone else in the card index that they had, and then following it on through, basically a kind of chain reaction of suspicion. The basic way to start checking on someone was to tell the post office to redirect all of their morning post to a special office in Victoria, where it was steamed open, photographed, glued shut again, and then passed on to people in the afternoon. And it said that communists knew that they had come to the attention of the authorities when they stopped getting any post in the morning. A slightly higher level of check, and much more expensive, and therefore used much more sparingly, was the telephone check. So I guess these days we can imagine that when telephones are being tapped, there's sort of automatic recording devices, and probably also automatic voice recognition. In the 1920s, a telephone check meant taking a particular number out of its normal exchange, where the operator would have been connecting them, sending it to a special exchange where security vetted women were doing the same job, and they listened in and they typed up your conversation live as they were listening. Finally, and most rarely, was live surveillance, so sending someone to pad about after a suspect. People were a huge worry, and that was obviously the main focus, but so was money. And actually, if you think about it, one of the things that the Soviet Union brought to the radical left wing across the world was a sense of status, and also backing in terms of real finance. People were a huge worry, and that was obviously the main focus, but so was money. And actually, if you think about it, one of the things that the Soviet Union brought to the radical left wing across the world was a sense of status, and also backing in terms of real finances. And it was backing them for the first 8 to 10 years of its existence with jewels. And that's not an exaggeration. Jewels were expropriated from the former middle and upper classes of Tsarist Russia in huge quantities. Nikolai Klitschko is one of the people who came off the ship in Newcastle upon Tyne and was being watched by the security services. Once the treaty was finished, he became the deputy head of Arcos and the trade mission in London. He was in control personally of £66 million worth of money in bank accounts based in Pall Mall, £66 million in today's money. And this drew attention from MI5, and they began to follow him, and they found that diplomatic wives were leaving Russia with suitcases full of jewellery and precious objects, taking them to Warsaw, where they were valued, and then transferred to Amsterdam, where they were sold on the black market, in such large quantities that they were actually affecting the value of diamonds and other jewellery on the world market. And the money was then passed to London to Klitschko, from where he dispersed it as he saw fit around the communist movements of the world. Klitschko was one type of figure that British intelligence followed in the 20s. Someone who basically was masquerading. He was here under an official, and had an official position in the trade delegation, but he was really spending almost all his time on one kind of illicit activity or another. Now down below is a man about whom much less has been written before now, and that's Jacob Kirchenstein. He smuggled himself into Britain on a steamship from Norway. He managed to operate under his fake identity of Johnny Walker, which we think came from the whiskey. And then he smuggled himself and his wife back out under a fake passport, which worried the British greatly when they discovered that. And he managed to smuggle himself back in again and stay for another 3 years under his own identity of Jacob Kirchenstein with a cover job in Arcos. And so this was an example of what British intelligence felt was so dangerous about Arcos. It was kind of giving legitimate cover to this man. The reason he was able to do that is because British intelligence didn't work out until several years after he'd been here as Johnny Walker that he'd actually been here. So he succeeded in getting in and getting out without ever being detected. London is the epicenter of espionage activity in the UK. It dominates both because that's where the resources are concentrated, and also because that's where, I guess, the centres of government and finance and politics are. The Society for Cultural Relations was founded in 1924 during the first Labour government, when there was a sort of thaw in Anglo-Russian relations. And it was supposed to be a friendly society which educated people about what was happening in the Soviet Union. It was based just a few streets away in Tavistock Square, at number 23 Tavistock Square. And it had all of these people, and a number of others, as its vice presidents. H.G. Wells, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Foster, and John Maynard Keynes. And on the face of this, it was quite an innocuous organisation. In its first year of existence, it had events about Russian poster art, village folk theatre, penal reform in the Soviet Union, Soviet music, and a gala event for the 200th anniversary of the Russian Academy of Sciences. But it had a sort of double purpose as distraction, because it was used by the Soviets partly to find people who might work as agents, and it was used to curry favour with important and influential people around the world, around Britain, who weren't prepared to join the Communist Party. But it also had a kind of second purpose, which was that MI5 and Special Branch over the years spent a lot of time on this organisation, time that they might have spent more profitably looking into other activities. So actually, I'm not sure that that's ever what the Soviets intended, but it did divert a lot of scarce resources. What about the Russians themselves, the Soviet citizens who came here? Where did they hang out? What did they do? What were their lives in London like? They decided to base themselves in Hampstead and Golders Green. That's where they lived, in a kind of community that was based around various, not all together in a single street, but within a couple of tube stops of one another. There was a lot of internal surveillance among the Soviet community in 1920s Britain. So a lot of Klitschko in particular was one of the leaders of watching what other Soviet citizens were doing and making sure that they weren't forming inappropriate relationships with local people and that they were living good revolutionary lives. After the death of Lenin, a Stalinist faction and a Trotskyite faction develops among the Soviet community in Britain, and we know that in particular because of Kirchenstein's confession, where he talks about allying himself with the Stalinist wing, and he's really quite anti-Semitic, and it seems that in London at least that the split was between Jews and non-Jews, or that's how he saw it anyway. I told you that Jacob and Valley Kirchenstein had managed to get out of London and then come back in again. When they came back in, perhaps rather cheekily, their first night they spent at the Savoy, which may have been part of their cover, or it may just have been a treat to themselves. And then also there's the episode at Frolics. So Frolics was a nightclub off Oxford Street, off Regent Street, and a White Russian informant told MI5 that Frolics was where Soviet employees, Soviet women went as Matahari figures to try and entrap British civil servants and British army officers after hours and turn them into Soviet agents. But we have a different source, a man who worked in Arcos and then defected from the Soviet Union, who describes a place very similar to Frolics, where the Soviet women and men went just to get drunk and let their hair down and dance. And he, rather horrifiedly, describes in a book he published in the early 1930s the following. One of them said to me, "Here nothing is not allowed. Here everything is possible. Drink, dance if you want to. If you want a girl, please yourself." So quite typical jazz age kind of activity among the Soviet citizens. From 1923 onwards, there was a succession of attempts to get the Russians out. British intelligence had the ear of some powerful people in the government. Lloyd George left the government and resigned in 1922. And as a result, Curzon initially tried by issuing an ultimatum to Russia to tell it that it had to stop illegal espionage and other seditious activities both in London and across the empire. 1924, 1925, 1926, there are further attempts, and I talk about those in the book. The Zinoviev letter, obviously most famously a dirty tricks campaign by British intelligence and probably some White Russians in the Baltic states to disrupt Anglo-Russian relations. The general strike in 1926. And finally, a realization among British intelligence apparatchiks and the establishment figures in Britain that if something's going to happen and they're going to get rid of the Russians, they need to force Stanley Baldwin's hand. He's not prepared to do this himself. So, with the help of the Home Secretary, a very right-wing Home Secretary called William Joynson Hicks, MI5 stumbles on a reason to raid Arcos with the help of a landlord from a pub in Uxbridge. In May 1927, 200 police raided the building, tore it apart, searched all of the Soviet citizens inside. To cut a long story short, the raid failed in the sense that no military documents were found, and by this stage the rhetoric, the anti-Russian rhetoric in the press in Britain was so great that the Russians would have been silly to keep any military documents or any other highly secret material in the Arcos headquarters, and indeed we have signals intelligence which shows that they had specifically ordered that any of that be taken back to Moscow. Nonetheless, from the point of view of British intelligence, it was a success because having done this and been on every front page in the world, Baldwin couldn't say, "Oh, sorry, we didn't find anything, so you Russians, you should just stay, we've made a mistake." Instead, he uses other intelligence from decrypted signals that they were able to read to justify expulsions and orders all of the Russians to leave. There's a sort of moment of mass celebration in July 1927 among right-wing people in Britain, people on the radical right. There's an event in the Albert Hall where the Albert Hall is filled with 5,000 people who are members of the Clear Out the Reds campaign, and they talk about having got their country back and how everything's going to be different now. And of course we know, in conclusion, that the UK's relationship with the USSR was by no means over in July 1927. In fact, it was only just beginning. The Russians were invited back in 1929, and it does seem to me at the end of all of this that British intelligence had learned a lesson, because from 1927 until 1937, they couldn't decrypt any Soviet signals that were coming across the airwaves, because they had told the Soviet state that they could understand them, so the Soviets changed their codes. So never again do we see this kind of error on the part of British intelligence.